Good morning. I'm delighted to be here, and it seems to be a very important time here in Chile looking at how you can better respect the human rights and include people with disabilities in law and policy in Chile. And I'm delighted to be here and share with you some of the developments that have been happening in Ireland as we face to resolve similar issues and challenges and barriers that exclude people with disabilities from inclusion in society in Ireland. So my presentation this morning is divided into two parts. Part one looks at disability law and policy in Ireland, and I'll be looking at the development of our national disability policy, which was published in 2004. And Ireland's national disability strategy was one of the first disability strategies at the national level in the world in 2004. And I'll talk about the ongoing implementation of that, and I'll look at some of the research that we've conducted in Galway on successful national disability plans, and perhaps some pointers for you as you develop your strategy, your national disability strategy here in Chile. The second part of my presentation then, I look at legal capacity law reform in Ireland, and that's something that I was directly involved with when I worked for Amnesty International on their mental health campaign back in 2011, 2012. And we have a new law that's been published in Ireland but yet to be enacted. So this is a very challenging area of law reform throughout the world. The UN Disability Convention requires us to move away from a substitute decision-making system that's in place throughout the world to supporting people with disabilities to make decisions. And I'll talk about the challenges and opportunities in Ireland in relation to that. So to turn now to look at the first part of the presentation, which is disability law and policy in Ireland and the development of a national disability strategy in Ireland. And I think a good place to start in seeing the history and the development in Ireland is the Strategy for Equality, which was published in 1996. So that's published nearly 20 years ago. And this was a report that was published in Ireland in 1996, and it came out of a similar commission to the commission that's been set up here in Chile. And it was a commission on the status of persons with disability. And this report was published in 1996, and that report was a seminal moment, a very important moment in Ireland for documenting the discrimination that people with disabilities faced in Ireland, and making a number of very important recommendations about removing barriers that prevented people with disabilities from full and equal citizenship and participation in society in Ireland. So the report, like I said, from the Commission on the Status of People with Disabilities was published in 1996. It had been established by Mervyn Taylor, who was the Minister for Equality and Law Reform at the time, in 1993. And the report took a number of years to compile. And there was a major consultative process. So the notion of nothing about us without us was very important. And people with disabilities were very much involved on the Commission itself, and also attended a number of meetings and made submissions to the Commission on the Status of People in Ireland. So that was a very important process. And in total, there were 600 written submissions received by the Commission, 327 from people with disabilities, and then parents and friends of people with disabilities, and other organisations, disabled persons organisations and other organisations made submissions, and they all attended meetings, consultative meetings throughout the state, throughout the early 1990s. When the Commission's report was published, there was a broad, extremely broad political consensus. So all politicians of all different political parties accepted the recommendations. They welcomed them. They acknowledged that these reforms that were recommended were very important. And also the report was widely welcomed and accepted within society, and it contained a huge amount of recommendations. So the work, the research that was done, the consultations, the submissions that were made identified a significant number of areas where people with disabilities face barriers and discrimination. And in total, the Commission on the Status of Persons with Disability made 402 recommendations for reform. So quite an important amount of law reform and policy work that needed to be done. And I'll just very briefly go over the different headings on which these recommendations came under. So the status of people with disabilities, so legal capacity, policy development and implementation, services for people with disabilities, income and disability, work and training, insurance, accessibility, health, education, housing for people with disabilities and accommodation, transport and mobility, telecommunications technology, the legal system, political rights, the inclusion of women with disabilities, sexuality and relationships, religious practice, arts and culture, media, sports, vulnerable persons with disabilities, research. So you can see there that there was a huge amount of law reform that was needed to remove barriers in society that restricted people with disabilities from full and equal citizenship and from participation in Irish society. And I've just kind of distilled the recommendations down into key recommendations, which I think are important. So one of the main recommendations was the creation of a specific body to advise government on policy related to persons with disabilities. This would be an established, ongoing, funded statutory body that would give advice to government, and that was established subsequently, and it was called the National Disability Authority. There was a lot of legislation in place in Ireland that related to people with disabilities, and it used inappropriate language, imbeciles, insanity, and other derogatory terms that weren't appropriate, and language that was very offensive, and there was a recognition that there needed to be reform of that. The Commission, in its report, the Strategy for Equality, also recommended a specific Disability Act so that people with disabilities could access services and other things. So that was recommended. There was also a recommendation for a comprehensive strategy from government on addressing the needs and the rights of people with disabilities. That was a key recommendation as well. Legal capacity law reform was another one, and I'll talk about that in the second part of the presentation. And then employment equality was a big issue. The fact that many people with disabilities weren't able to access the labour market, that was a significant issue that was identified. And then, in addition to that, in terms of medical treatment, people with disabilities had barriers in accessing medical treatment, and that was to be addressed as well. There was a key recommendation to remove discrimination in accessing medical treatment and medical services. So people were really happy with this. There was broad political consensus. Everything looked good. Okay, we've got a good strategy here. There's really key recommendations. The politicians are agreeing to this. They support this. But actually, in reality, nothing much happened. There was a lack of implementation. And at the end of 1999, an internal audit, so this is probably even overly optimistic, by the government showed that 20% of the report's recommendations were implemented in full, and there was partial, piecemeal implementation of other recommendations. So it was actually quite disappointing for people that were involved, for disabled people's organisations, for civil society, and for people who worked on the Commission. There was a real sense of, well, look, we put all this hard work in, we came up with a good strategy, there was acceptance, but yet we don't have implementation. Things didn't change for people with disabilities in any meaningful way. So that was quite disappointing. One of the two things that were implemented and that are quite good was anti-discrimination law. So this wasn't just for disability. There was 9 grounds in which it was unlawful to discriminate against people with disabilities and other people based on sexual orientation, based on marital status, based on gender, based on religion. And there's 9 particular grounds in total. I won't go through all of them, but disability is one of those. So the Employment Equality Act of 1998, that was a seminal piece of legislation that prohibited discrimination in access to employment and also in treatment in employment. And from a disability perspective, it was a real milestone. It was based on the Americans with Disability Act 1990, and it introduced the concept of reasonable accommodation, that if an employer doesn't make a reasonable adjustment for a person to access a job or to continue in the job with a disability, that's discrimination. So that was provided for in the legislation. That's a very important development that came out of the 1996 report. And the other one is the Equal Status Act. So the Equal Status Act from 2000, that prohibits the providers of goods and services that are publicly available from discriminating against a person with a disability. Okay, so if a person with a disability wants to go to the cinema, wants to go to a bar, wants to access any good or service that's generally available to the public, it's unlawful to discriminate or deny access to that service. Okay, so with some exceptions. So that was quite an important development, in that we have very robust legislation in Ireland that people with disabilities can use if they're discriminated against in employment, or if they're discriminated against in terms of accessing goods and services. That's really good. I would say this, you might think that, well, if you have this anti-discrimination law, more people with disabilities will get employment, and that isn't simply the case. It's a remedy, but actually you need more systematic, targeted policies and strategies for addressing the unemployment of persons with disabilities. And the research internationally, the international research would show that anti-discrimination law in and of itself doesn't increase the participation of people with disabilities, but it's important because it allows a remedy where there is discrimination. Okay, so that was an important development out of the 1996 report. So we also had the creation of an equality authority, which had a mandate for, supporting people to take cases, and they also provided guidance to employers and to employees around non-discrimination across the 9 protected grounds, including disability. And in 2014, our Equality Authority was merged with our Human Rights Commission, so that mandate now is exercised by our Human Rights and Equality Commission, established in 2014. Okay, so I referred to this already, the National Disability Authority. This is something that you might want to think of here in Chile, is that this is a dedicated organisation that's set up. It's supposed to be independent, but its independence, I would have questions about how independent it is. It could be more critical, I feel, but it's a body set up to give expert advice to the government on its disability policy, and that's the National Disability Authority. I think in Ireland it could be more robust. It should be more led from persons with disabilities, and that's something that you might want to think about here as part of your National Disability Strategy, the creation of a dedicated body to advise government on issues facing persons with disabilities. Okay. I want to talk now about our National Disability Strategy, and like I said at the start, this is one of the first national disability strategies in the world. It was published in 2004, and it really came about from pressure that was placed on the government by persons with disabilities and their representative organisations and their families and friends. So there was a very significant move in Irish society to get the government to take real and concrete steps to address the discrimination experienced by people with disabilities, their exclusion from society, and barriers which prevented them from having full and equal citizenship. Okay, so it was really a grassroots movement. That's important to note. And there was political pressure put to bear to come up with a plan that would actually realise full participation of people with disabilities in society. And the government in 2004 published its National Disability Strategy. Now, what I should say from the start is that I think the National Disability Strategy is good, but I'm going to be critical about it because it's a good strategy, but there's been very weak implementation in Ireland. So I think it's a good model, but there's been very weak implementation in Ireland. So let me talk about the National Disability Strategy. There are core elements to it. So if I can break it into 3 parts, okay? The first part is legislation, okay? So I'll talk about that in a while. The main piece is the National Disability Act 2005. The Disability Act 2005, I'll talk about that in a while. So there's legislation, there's other pieces of legislation as well, so there's law, that's the first part. The second part are these sectoral plans, detailed plans by key government departments in Ireland about what they're going to do within their remit to address the barriers facing people with disabilities, okay? And the third part of that is funding. So there was funding made available from 2004 to 2009 to implement the policy and to provide for the recommendations and the plan to be put in place. Okay, so there are 3 parts: the law, legislation, the sectoral plans, detailed government department plans, and the third part then is the funding that was made available. Okay, so the Disability Act 2005 was the main part of that. I'll talk about that in a while. But we also had a significant issue around education for people with disabilities in Ireland. Okay? And there had been a number of cases taken to the High Court, a senior court in Ireland, by parents who were very frustrated by the lack of education for their children. There's a constitutional right in Ireland to free primary education. And parents who felt that their children, they didn't receive much education because they had a disability, there were no services there, they had to take constitutional litigation to try and enforce that right, and they lost. The Supreme Court in Ireland ultimately said that it would be in breach of the separation of powers to allow the courts to enforce socio-economic rights. That's put very simplistically, but that's what happened. But the government did acknowledge that they needed to provide more funding. More funding was made available. And then we also had this piece of legislation, which is the Education for Persons with Disabilities, Special Education Needs, EPSN Act from 2004, which facilitates assessment of the needs for education of children. So it was a development, but it hasn't been fully enacted. The third part of the legislation that was implemented in Ireland was around advocacy. So this act here from 2007, the Citizen Information Act 2007, it provided for funding for an advocacy service for people with disabilities to empower people and support people to assert their rights and to navigate the administrative systems, the social welfare system, and to support the person in general. So they're the three parts of it: the Disability Act, the Education Act, and the Advocacy Act. These three parts here. Okay, so the Disability Act in 2005 then, what are the main aspects of that? Well, it provides a statutory basis, so it's based on legislation, for an assessment of need for health and education for people with disabilities, okay? So it provides that people with disability, they are entitled to an assessment of what they need for education and for health. Now, all of that hasn't been commenced, but that's quite an important development. There was an earlier bill which wasn't as strong, the Disability Act 2002, Bill 2002, but the disabled persons organisations of people with disabilities weren't willing to accept it, and the government withdrew it, and they came out with this act instead. There's a requirement in the Disability Act 2005 that all public services give accessible information. Okay, that's important. So there's a requirement in all public bodies that they provide accessible information and that they make their services accessible to people with disabilities. And from a practical perspective, in terms of physical accessibility within buildings, it imposed a statutory obligation on all public buildings to meet minimum standards for accessibility, and the National Disability Authority were very key with drawing up those standards. So from a practical perspective, the Act has done those things relatively well. Okay, so that's important. Another core part of the Disability Act 2005 is that it pushed the need to have these detailed plans by government, the key government departments, on a statutory basis. So there's a legal requirement on these government departments to draw up these plans, and they have drawn up these plans. And one of the innovative things in the Disability Act 2005 was that it imposed a legal obligation on all public bodies and all government departments to employ at least 3% of people with disabilities. Okay? So there's a quota. Every public body in Ireland, every government department, they have to employ at least 3% of persons with disabilities, and the National Disability Authority have a role around monitoring and ensuring compliance with that quota. So it's a 3% quota for the employment of persons with disabilities. Okay. So the sectoral plans, these are the key areas, these are the key government departments that are required to draw up plans that are detailed about ensuring that their policy and their rules take on board the needs of people with disabilities. So you have communications, the Department of Communications and Marine, the Department for Responsibility for Employment, the Department with responsibility for environment, and environment in Ireland has also responsibility for voting and lots of other areas, the Department of Health, the Department of Social Welfare, and the Department of Transport. So they're the key areas. And the reason why you have these sectoral plans is that you have a joined up whole government approach to removing barriers faced by people with disabilities. So it's supposed to be smart by government, a joined-up approach that's going to be, really getting a very effective response to removing barriers for people with disabilities. And these sectoral plans have great potential for actually improving the lives of people with disabilities and ensuring equal citizenship. Okay, so what happened in Ireland? So we had the plan, and we had the legislation, some of which wasn't commenced. We had the sectoral plans, and then in 2008 we had a terrible downturn in the global economy, which particularly affected Ireland. So resources became very scarce, and our government had to take, in 2010, had to take a bailout from the Troika, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the European Bank, the European Central Bank, and the EU. So it had to take a bailout, and that bailout required them to reduce their budgets or national expenditure by billions of euros for a small country that really hit social welfare, and we saw an awful lot of cuts to disability funding. So that really hampered the implementation of the National Disability Strategy. And the reality is that a lot of it remains unimplemented, and that's because the resources, the government weren't in a position, they would say, or weren't willing to provide the resources to have implementation of the strategy. So that's an important point. One of the things I would also point out is that we have the National Disability Strategy, but there were other key government policy documents published which were very relevant to the National Disability Strategy. So you had a housing initiative, you had housing for people with disabilities, a time to move on from congregated settings for people with mental disabilities. There was a strategy published there. You had a vision for change, which was the mental health strategy published in 2006. You had an older person strategy. You had a strategy for carers published after the disability strategy, and to my mind, I don't think that there's been a significant connection between new initiatives by the government and the existing disability strategy. So that's something I would say to you here in Chile, is that make sure when you're developing your national disability strategy that it has built into that an ability to take on board and to connect with other policies that are developed. So, like I said, the banking crisis, and we had a reduction in the number of resources made available. And in 2011, we got a new government in Ireland, and they did make a commitment to the National Disability Strategy. Disabled persons organisations really campaigned on that. They ensured that this new government, it's a coalition government, that they gave a commitment to the National Disability Strategy, which they did, and they were to come up with an implementation plan, which they did. It's an implementation plan from 2013 to 2015. Now, I'm really sceptical about this. I've read through it a number of times, and I read through it again recently for this conference, and I'm afraid not much has been progressed on that. The resources aren't available. So it's quite disappointing that we've got a very good plan, but we haven't got the resources made available. So we have this National Disability Strategy Implementation Plan from 2013 to 2015, and a lot of it remains unimplemented. And the government were very unambitious when they drew up this plan. They were giving very kind of loose commitments to what they were going to do. So I'll talk about that. So. And I should point out that the disabled persons organisations have been really critical in Ireland. So disabled people and their representative organisations have been critical of the implementation plan, and they've been very critical of government, and they're very disillusioned, disappointed with the lack of progress. And they are continually, in their own advocacy work, highlighting that to the media and to government. So really my message from Ireland, from my perspective, is that we've got a good strategy but poor implementation. And in Ireland, not just in relation to disability policy, I could diagnose the government with a serious condition, that of implement deficit disorder, the ability to make a good plan but the failure to implement it. So that's, I think, perhaps something that's common, maybe not just to Ireland. Okay, so in the Centre for Disability Law and Policy, where I'm based in Ireland, we did a study, and I'll make the findings available to the Commission and There's a book which I've given a reference to at the end of the presentation, which looks at this. We looked at success factors for a successful national disability strategy, and we identified 8 critical success factors. So if you're going to have a successful strategy here in Chile on disability, these are the 8 things you need to factor into your strategy to make it effective. Okay, the first one is leadership. Okay, so there has to be leadership within government in relation to implementation of the strategy, and also from civil society there has to be leadership shown from civil society. And very often with all sectors there can be different voices, different perspectives and conflicts within the sector, and I'm sure that's something that was the case in Ireland, and it's probably the case here too, that there may be different competing interests within the disabled persons organisation. So there needs to be leadership. You need to figure out, you need to have a concerted effort. There needs to be consensus. You need to come together and decide who's going to represent you at the national level, the local level and at the international level. So that needs to come from you, from civil society, and you need to take leadership in around this, being vocal and calling on the government to abide by the strategy. So that's important. Leadership in government and in civil society is core. And the second success factor that's critical is the participation of people with disabilities in implementing and monitoring the National Disability Strategy. So that's really important, and this involves a lot more than just consultation with people with disabilities. People with disabilities have to have ownership over the process, and deaf people and people with intellectual disability or mental disabilities are often excluded from this process. So deaf people and people with all disabilities need to be involved, and there really needs to be an independent element to that as well. So it goes beyond consultation. People with disabilities have to be at the heart of the implementation and the monitoring of the implementation of the National Disability Strategy. There was reference by the first speaker in relation to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and what I would say to you in relation to that is that a national disability strategy is now recognised as one of the key components to ensuring that Chile and every other state party to the Convention comply with their obligations under the Convention. So there needs to be a joined up approach between the UN CRPD, the UN Disability Convention, and the National Disability Strategy. So to avoid duplication and to ensure that what's been done to recognise the rights of people with disabilities in terms of the UN Disability Convention and the National Disability Strategy there's no overlap, and that they're singing off the same hymn sheet, if I might put it like that. The fourth critical success factor that we saw for good implementation of national disability strategies is that there are positive legal obligations and proper funding. So that's really important. So, for example, in the Irish Disability Strategy, we have that 3% quota for the employment of people with disabilities, non-discrimination law, or Employment Equality Act 1998, access to goods and services, the Equal Status Act 2000. So, anti-discrimination law, positive discrimination, positive measures, they're a core part, and adequate funding is very important as well. And I would say to you in relation to the funding for the government as they develop the National Disability Strategy, there's a real need for costing of the National Disability Strategy, because if you don't have a costing, you don't know what you're going to be able to achieve and implement, and you need to be honest about what you can achieve, what's realistic, and what you are going to make available in terms of resources. And it's really important that you do that as well, because you can then identify the barriers to implementation. So what happens if you fail to implement and resources have been made available? You need the evidence there. And the first step in removing barriers to change is seeing what went wrong. So it's really important that you cost it, and that needs to underpin the strategy. The next critical success factor is transparency and accountability in the reporting and on looking at the progress of the National Disability Strategy. Now, that's something we haven't had in Ireland. I feel that there's been a lack of transparency and accountability, so there needs to be accountability within government for the delivery of it, and that the reporting process has to be honest, it has to be open, it has to be independent. So that's really important. I would see that as a real important point, so that once you have your disability strategy, that there's independent there's accountability, and there's transparency, and there is independent monitoring of it. So you can't have just the government saying yes, we're doing well. You need critical oversight. Another critical success factor is mainstreaming disability equality. And what do I mean by that? Well, it means that you have your national disability strategy, but you have lots of other areas of policy which impact people with disabilities, and you need to ensure that that's disability proofed. You need to consider the impact of new policy on people with disabilities. There's a good example of that from the United Kingdom, where all legislation gets a disability audit, so to look at how it impacts people with disabilities. So that is a key component as well, that you just don't have your national disability strategy, that you have you consider disability in all policy areas, and mainstreaming disability equality is an important part of that. So that's a core point. So my last two critical success factors are here. I've kind of referred to this already: independent monitoring and review of the national disability strategy. That's core. You need that. And the next point was actually something that was also alluded to by the first speaker this morning, which is indicators and data. And there's models for that, as we saw this morning. So you need to have the evidence base, okay? And the speaker spoke about that this morning. I won't dwell much more time on that, but you need the statistical measurement, otherwise you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what's effective or what's not effective. So that's an important area. You need to have indicators, you need to have data, and that you need to have a scientific way of implementing, of measuring the implementation of the strategy. Okay, so just to conclude on the Irish National Disability Strategy, in Ireland I think we've got a really good strategy which has been poorly implemented. A part of that is down to failures of government and the economic climate, but I think those critical success factors that I talked about, they are core, and they should be really considered for how you adapt those into your strategy to ensure that your strategy is actually implemented and is actually successful. Okay, so I'm moving on now to the second part of the presentation, which is on legal capacity law reform. Okay, this is actually quite an important topic in Ireland. Believe it or not, the legislation in Ireland dates to 1871. So the current legislation operates under a piece of legislation called the Lunacy Regulation Ireland Act from 1871. So that's the current law in Ireland, the Lunacy Regulation Ireland Act 1871. And there's been recognition since 1996, since that Commission on the Status of Persons with Disabilities report, A Strategy for Equality, that we needed to remove that law and put in something that supported people with disabilities. But that actually hasn't happened. And I used to work for the Law Reform Commission in Ireland, and we did a lot of work on that, which culminated in 2007. So we looked at, comparatively, how we were going to have better laws to support people make decisions. And the current position in Ireland is that our law is not in compliance with the UN Disability Convention, and it's not even in compliance with the regional human rights mechanism, the European Convention on Human Rights. So currently in Ireland, we have very poor legislation. It's wholly inconsistent with human rights. But we've done an awful lot of work. We've done an awful lot of work, and we now have a new piece of legislation. It's a bill. It's not enacted yet. It's called the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Bill, 2013. So, when enacted, this legislation will be much better, and there's much greater scope for supporting people with disabilities to make decisions. And what I should say is that this legislation is not just about disability. This legislation in Ireland and here in Chile, it affects everybody. You know, hopefully we'll all grow older and we'll live very full lives. But as you grow older, very often people begin to question your decisions, and you need mechanisms, and you need legislation, and you need support to ensure that you can make your decisions and that third parties don't make decisions for you. So this is not just about people with disabilities, it's also about older people, it's about all of us, this legislation. And we need proper regulation, we need proper law that support us to make decisions. And people with disabilities are particularly vulnerable to having somebody else, a third party, a substitute decision maker, make decisions for them. And this legislation in Ireland, we hope, when enacted, will ensure that people with disabilities are supported to make decisions to a greater extent than they currently are. Okay. So, really, the new legislation, the 2013 bill, It seeks to strike a balance between autonomy and protection. So it's recognising that sometimes people need support to make decisions, and that should be proportionate, and people's decision-making capacity shouldn't be removed. And it remains to be seen in Ireland whether the correct balance has been struck. I don't think our legislation is going to be fully compliant with the UN Disability Convention, but I think it's the Irish legislation, the proposed legislation internationally is recognised as a good model for what is more compliant with the UN Disability Convention. So the work of the Law Reform Commission, which was completed in 2007, it resulted in a bill in 2008, a heads of a bill, so an outline of a bill in 2008. And there was a lot of opposition to that from disabled persons' organisations who wanted a more progressive piece of legislation, and that's what happened. We now have this Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Bill 2013, which is much better than the 2008 version. So it was published in 2013, in July 2013, and it was developed in our Department of Justice. So the Department of Justice in Ireland developed this legislation. Okay, I just have a slide there on some of the terminology in the bill, but the bill will apply to people over the age of 18 years of age, and the person whose decision-making capacity is being questioned for the purposes of the bill, they're known as the relevant person. Okay, so one of the things that we have in the Irish legislation that I think is good is that we have general principles. We have principles set out in the draft bill, and that's there to guide everybody about how they support people to make decisions. So it's there for judges, if it comes before the courts, it's there for anybody who is looking at the legislation, and that's quite important. So these guiding principles in the law are very important because they tell us the spirit of the legislation and how the legislation should be applied. So in the legislation there is a presumption of capacity for everybody. So everybody has capacity, regardless of being an older person, having a mental health problem, having intellectual disability or a physical disability. Everybody has capacity, so that there's a presumption of that. And it does recognise that in certain limited circumstances, where people are unable to make decisions, a decision can only be made with that person after all efforts have been made to help the person make the decision. So the focus is on supporting the person to make the decision, but that if there is some extreme circumstance where a person isn't able to make a decision, that can be done, but only after all efforts have been made to support the person to make the decision. So one of the guiding principles is that the information in relation to making decisions under the bill has to be easily understood and relevant to the person. So it has to be tailored. So there's a real obligation here to reasonably accommodate. Okay, that's a core part of it. And unwise decisions. So if you think about it, somebody's ability to make decisions with a disability, if they make a bad decision, they're vulnerable to having a third party take away their ability to make a decision. And in the legislation, one of the guiding principles is that people are able to make unwise decisions. You are able to make an unwise decision, and that doesn't mean that you're going to lose your legal capacity. So that's quite an important inclusion in the actual act itself, in the legislation. When there's any intervention that is permitted under the legislation, it's only as a last resort, and the focus is on supporting the person to make decisions, like I said. Now, in the legislation, there's no reference to the best interests of the person, okay? And in Ireland, the best interest principle has been the best interest principle developed in family law in relation to children, okay? It's not an appropriate principle in relation to adults, okay? And people with disabilities, their decision-making ability, their ability to make decisions, their legal capacity is often restricted in light of their best interests. So somebody else thinking what's better for somebody else. And in this legislation, the best interest isn't a general principle. So the best interest isn't mentioned here. And what's referred to is acting in accordance with the person's will and preferences. So acting in accordance with a person's will and preferences. And that is consistent with the UN Disability Convention, okay? So the UN Disability Convention, there's no reference in the UN CRPD to acting in the best interests of an adult. There's only reference to the best interest of the child. And even with that, there has to be recognition of the evolving capacity of the child. But there's no reference in the UN Disability Convention to the best interests of an adult with a disability. So that's really important. And in this legislation, it's seeking to ward off paternalism, to push away paternalistic impulses. And the focus here is on the will and preference of the person and supporting the person to make decisions in circumstances where they may need support. Having said that, the Irish legislation does retain a functional definition of capacity, and that is questionable under the UN Disability Convention. So this is actually the test that's in the legislation for assessing capacity. It's an ability to understand the information relevant to the decision, to remember that information even for a short period of time, then to use that information that they've understood and retained, and to weigh it up. Okay, to weigh up the information, and then the next part of it is to communicate by any means, including with the assistance of a third party. So there is that functional assessment of capacity. That's questionable under Article 12 of the UN CRPD, but from a practical perspective, it's felt that was important to include. Okay. So I have here 5 different categories that are proposed in the bill. Okay. So these are categories of support, ways in which a person can be assisted to make a decision. Now, some of them are better than others, okay? So we have a decision-making assistant, we've got a co-decision maker, then we have a decision-making representative, then we have informal decision-making, and then we have the court making decisions. So I'll talk through these very quickly, but in the legislation we also have powers of attorney, which has been brought over from another piece of legislation, and we also have healthcare directives, so a person can make a plan about how they're going to be treated in terms of their health if they aren't able to communicate what they want in the future. So we have advanced healthcare directives, they're called other things in other parts of the world. Living wills is what they're called sometimes as well, but we have advanced healthcare directives provided for in the legislation. Okay, so a decision-making assistant, very briefly, this is a person who is really supporting a person to make a decision, and they've got particular obligations under the legislation, and they'll make a decision-making agreement with the person, and there's going to be a new office of public guardian created, and there's a registration process there. So this decision-making assistant is somebody that's going to support a person with a disability to make a decision, okay? Their role is really to advise and explain relevant information, and the requirement there is to act in accordance with the will and preference of the person they're supporting. So it's very much compliant with Article 12 of the UN Disability Convention. It recognises the legal capacity of the person, it supports the person to make a decision. The next form of support is that of co-decision making, and a person will make a decision jointly with somebody else, and the person has to be a suitable person. And the court will will grant this co-decision making agreement. Okay, so there'll be an order from the court around this. So this is another way of supporting a person to make a decision. Somebody else will support the person and make a decision with them. Okay, so that's co-decision making. I won't get into too much detail on it. The next category is that of decision making representative. Okay, now this isn't as compliant with the UN Disability Convention as the other provisions. But this applies in those limited circumstances where somebody is considered that they aren't able to make a decision with the assistance of a co-decision maker or support. Okay, so it's less compliant with the UN Disability Convention, and it only would apply in very limited circumstances where somebody isn't able to make a decision. And the court will have a role in appointing this decision-making representative. Okay, so it's really a form of substitute decision-making, but it's only considered to happen in very limited cases. We'll see when it's enacted. Then the next category is informal decision-making. So this has to do with decisions that are made on a daily basis by, let's say, a family member or a carer for a person with a disability. And the goal here is to protect a person for liability if they make a decision. But it applies really to kind of welfare decisions, kind of personal welfare decisions about dress, choices, ordinary kind of daily decisions about washing and about how to go to the supermarket, those type of decisions. You have this kind of protection for informal decision making. But there's a risk there that informal decision making will be a route to substitute decision making. That's not permitted. But there's this provision in the Act to kind of give some kind of regulation around informal decision making. And the last one then is decision-making authority of the court. So if there is a dispute as to what a person's wishes are, so for example, if there's family members disputing a person's ability to make a decision, the court will decide about what to do. And in Ireland that will mainly be the Circuit Court, and then the High Court, which is the higher court, they'll decide important things around healthcare, for example, non-therapeutic sterilisation, the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment, organ donation, those very important biomedical issues. If there's a question there, those will be decided by the High Court. But if there's any kind of dispute as to a person's ability to make a decision, or if there's conflict between a provision of the Act, the courts will make a decision. Now that should only happen in a small number of cases. In theory, it remains to be seen what happens in practice. Just to talk very briefly about this, under the bill there's going to be created this Office of Public Guardian. Now it's not going to be called that, it's going to be called the Office of Support, Decision Making and Support. So this is going to be changed, I understand, in the final law. And the role here of this office will be to promote the rights of people with disabilities, to lay down codes of conduct around decision-making support under those different categories. So that's quite important. They'll have an important awareness-making role as well around that. So that's important. Just to talk about the law reform process, it's actually been a very long process in Ireland. People have been working on this since the 1990s. There's a real urgency to implement this legislation. We have very inappropriate legislation. It's been a very long road, but actually what's been very important is that disabled persons organisation, older persons organisation, civil society, human rights organisations like the one I worked for, Amnesty International, we came together and we did a lot of lobbying about having more human rights compliant legislation. And I think our legislation really is good insofar as it provides much greater scope to support a person making decisions. This is actually quite useful, I think, for you here in Chile. When I was in Amnesty International, we developed 10 essential principles in relation to legal capacity law. And I'm going to wrap it up here so that we have time for questions and answers. But you can read through these in your own time. And really, these principles are what we felt in civil society reflected the UN Disability Convention. So I've set them out here and I've given you a link to them online. These are a real synopsis of them, but really it's about the will and preference of the person, the fact that only in very, very limited extreme circumstances can somebody, a third party, make a decision for somebody else, and that any legislation has to support the person to make the decision themselves, and there's an obligation on the state to provide a system of supported decision making such as that we are creating in Ireland. So you can read through those in your own time. I have some links here for you, which is information in this. Unfortunately, it's in English, but perhaps the Commission might translate and make available to you. So I think I have a little time for a few questions, if that's possible, or if anybody wants to ask me a question. Thank you.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos. Muy buenas tardes a la señora Mahón. Soy estudiante de la Universidad Católica del Paraíso, de la carrera de Trabajo Social. Vamos a trabajar con mi compañera en una tesis relacionada mencionaba sobre trabajo y discapacidad. Entonces mi pregunta es referida principalmente a eso. ¿Cuál sería, a lo mejor desde la legislación, desde un punto de vista de la legislación laboral, una de las medidas más adecuadas para una real inclusión de una persona con discapacidad en el mundo laboral? Gracias.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's a very important question. And if you look at the WHO the work of the International Labour Organization, you'll see that a challenge for every country throughout the world is to create the right environment for ensuring participation in the labour market of persons with disabilities. One part of it has to be about anti-discrimination law, so giving a remedy to a person if they're discriminated against in relation to employment, both access to employment and also, termination if they acquire a disability or if an employer doesn't provide a reasonable accommodation. So that's one part of it. But like I said in the presentation, anti-discrimination law in and of itself doesn't actually promote and increase the participation of persons with disabilities in the labour market. So what you need actually is a comprehensive employment strategy for persons with disabilities. And there is a commitment in Ireland to develop that strategy. It hasn't happened, so I think that's quite important. And also, I think disabled persons organisations have to engage with employers. And in Ireland, we have a woman called Caroline Casey, and she has this NGO that she runs a national awards. It's televised every year in Ireland, and she does it also, I think, in other countries throughout the world, where they give awards to employers who and they showcase good examples of the employment of persons with disabilities. I think initiatives like that are quite important because it raises awareness and it kind of combats the attitudinal barriers that restrict access to the labour market for persons with disabilities. I hope that's something.
Hola, buenas tardes. Soy Patricio Paranilla de la Fundación Esperanza Nuestra, organización de y para personas con discapacidad. Uno de los grandes problemas que tenemos como sociedad civil en Chile es que las iniciativas contemplan muy poco ayuda de financiamiento a la organización. Los avances que se han logrado en Chile realmente han sido para el bolsillo de los propios dirigentes sociales, inclusive para asistir a alguna reunión. Pero lo planteado por usted, que en Irlanda muchas de estas iniciativas están financiadas, cosa que en Chile no ha pasado así, porque quedan muchas veces en papel por falta justamente de financiamiento. Ahora, el financiamiento que se ha logrado en Irlanda es porque la sociedad civil lo exigió o porque las autoridades gubernamentales consideraban que era importante que junto con las ideas y el planteamiento debiera ir este financiamiento económico. Gracias.
That's a really good question, and it's a really good question, and it is something that has been an issue and a challenge in Ireland as well. Disabled persons organisations, they do a lot of self-funding, and also they do get some government funding. And I think that there's a kind of there's a bit of a balancing act to do there about independence and retaining independence. But I think a unified disabled persons organisation movement is quite good, because you can, if there is cooperation, you can try and maximise resources and bring pressure to bear on actually giving your resources, which is difficult. But one of the things that disabled persons organisations in Ireland, they're actually quite critical, because a lot of them are very independent, and they call the government out on their rhetoric, so false promises, unimplemented promises. I think that critical voice is very important. So I think in terms of taking resources from government for disabled persons organisations, you need to be mindful that you need to also retain your independence.
Quería hacer una consulta. Actualmente en Chile las personas con discapacidad que no puedan, que no se incluyen en discapacidad de dar un consentimiento, no pueden participar en la investigación, pero sí pueden ser sometidas, por ejemplo, a una esterilización. Quisiera saber si es que en Irlanda eso ha sido normado con criterios radicales, de todo o nada, o con criterios de gradualidad.
Okay, so my understanding in Ireland is that there is no forced sterilisation, so non-therapeutic sterilisation doesn't happen, and that's a particular issue. There's actually a case against France pending before the European Court of Human Rights where there is evidence in practice in France of the forced sterilisation of women with mental disabilities, intellectual disabilities in France. That doesn't happen in Ireland. It's very questionable. It would be, to my mind, in breach of international human rights law, in breach of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I think in your legal capacity legislation, you should put in place safeguards against that to provide that there's so that there's no forced non-therapeutic sterilisation of people with disabilities.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Gloria Cerón. Quería hacerte la consulta respecto a la experiencia de ustedes. En Chile nosotros tenemos la ley 2422 que emana de la Convención sobre los Derechos de las Personas en Situación de Discapacidad. Nos hemos enfrentado a que el Estado elabora normativas, ¿cierto?, en la misma estrategia que tú estás señalando, y tenemos una presentación de organizaciones de ley para personas en situación de discapacidad fuerte de la sociedad civil. Pero nos hemos enfrentado a cómo hacemos el cambio cultural en la sociedad chilena, de hacerla finalmente inclusiva y de respeto a los derechos humanos. Quería que me contaran un poco la experiencia de ustedes, porque efectivamente aquí se da una figura de Estado, de sociedad civil, organizada para lograr la plena inclusión social de las personas en situación de discapacidad, pero hay una sociedad civil que se nos va llevando un poco más atrás. ¿Cuál fue la estrategia que implementaron ustedes en ese punto?
Okay, so disabled persons organisations were very involved in the development of the National Disability Strategy, and in terms of monitoring it, there was this National Disability Strategy stakeholders group, of which a number of disabled persons organisations were represented. But actually, that was a very weak process, and they would have been critical of that. So I suppose the independence is important there, that they've retained their critical voice, and even though they're engaged with the monitoring process, they've been very critical. And that was important for bringing about the recent review, so the current review and the implementation plan, which was published in 2013. But at the same time, it's been ineffective. So in Ireland, I think we have quite a good, quite a strong disabled persons organisation, civil society movement, but they've had limited success, and they've said that themselves in relation to the implementation of the National Disability Strategy, which is why those critical success factors that I talked about in the presentation about independent monitoring of your National Disability Strategy is core, and it has to be the case that persons with disabilities and your representative organisations are to the fore and are included in those independent mechanisms that should form part of your National Disability Strategy monitoring mechanism.
Hola, yo soy Sandra González, educadora diferencial, y mi consulta pone un poco a lo que señalaste sobre la limitación que tuvieron del uso de recursos para poder implementar la política que promovían, ¿verdad?, el derecho de las personas en situación de discapacidad. Y la verdad es que mi consulta tiene que ver con lo que pasa en Chile. Hoy día en Chile sí existe un montón de normativas que promueven el acceso y resguardan los derechos de las personas en situación de discapacidad. La institucionalidad que existe no da el ancho para regular el uso de los recursos implementados que existen, por ejemplo, en el área de educación. Por lo tanto, además que no se resguarde ese uso de recursos, también existe una ignorancia frente a lo que pasa en las escuelas más vulnerables, que en general son las más inclusivas. Por lo tanto, mi consulta va a si la situación de dificultad que tuvieron ustedes para llevar llevar a cabo la implementación de políticas para las personas en situación de discapacidad para acceder a educación, por ejemplo, tuvieron que ver solo con la limitación del uso de recursos o también existieron dificultades con el manejo, ¿verdad?, y el liderazgo de la institucionalidad, ¿verdad?, de cómo se resguardan esos recursos, la utilización adecuada.
Great, thank you. So if you see here, we had legislation around access to education for persons with disabilities, but it hasn't been fully commenced. So that involves an assessment for needs. So there's been a resource, really the fact that it hasn't been implemented has been the very poor economy, high unemployment, and the debt in Ireland. So there hasn't been the resources that would have been available 7 or 8 years ago, or 10 years ago when the plan was drawn up available. So I think what's important though, as part of our plan, is that we have this act, the EPSAN Act, the Education for Persons with Special Needs Education. So it actually has a very transparent process around that, and where it has been, the parts of it that have been commenced have been successful. So I think that's quite important. In terms of research, that's a problem in countries all throughout the world, and there is actually a requirement in the UN Disability Convention for governments to have proper statistics of persons with disabilities. So as part of your input into this national disability strategy, you should require that your government to provide adequate funding to monitor and to get the evidence base so that they have the information and the data they need to have an effective plan. So I think that survey that's been done and the results which are now coming out will be part of that, but you also need to see which gaps aren't addressed by that.
Hola, mi nombre es Patricia Rogna y quería felicitarte porque tu presentación me parece maravillosa, música para mis oídos, porque en América Latina estamos muy lejos todavía de tener una ley sobre capacidad jurídica, ustedes están muy cerca. Mi pregunta es, ¿cómo reconvierten el sistema jurídico? ¿Cómo los jueces, los abogados, por ejemplo en América Latina, el sistema de tutores y curadores, que es algo que ya se ha instalado, existen todavía los juicios de intervención? ¿Cómo ustedes reconvirtieron el sistema jurídico?
Well, actually, we wanted in Ireland to get rid of the courts entirely. We didn't want the courts having any role, or a very limited role. And when I was in Amnesty International, we campaigned quite hard for a tribunal system similar under our mental health legislation for people who are involuntarily detained, to have a tribunal, a lay tribunal, determine issues about our capacity. Now, we campaigned hard for that. The government wouldn't provide that because it would involve expenditure for a new system. But we feel that other legislation, it doesn't have to have the court. You could have a tribunal system which is multidisciplinary and more responsive to the person. And we don't feel that a court necessarily is the appropriate place for somebody with a disability or an older person to come to talk about their decision making and their legal capacity. So I think maybe removing the court entirely. But if you retain a court, I think training for judges is quite important. And I think judges sometimes have very fixed attitudes, and they need to be trained on human rights, on the UN Disability Convention, and on the social model of disability.
Quando corretto sul marco legale prima di capacità giuridica, tal come dico, vado
think the area of legal capacity is one of the most challenging areas of law reform, and it's very difficult for politicians, the legislator, for psychiatrists, for professionals, for families, for people with disabilities to get their head around the issues. So it's very, very challenging. It's very, very difficult. In terms of models of good practice, I don't know of any system that is fully compliant with the UN Disability Convention. And I don't think the Irish system will be fully compliant, although I think it's a very positive system that has the potential to support people to make decisions. And it'll be interesting to listen to Matt in Matt's presentation tomorrow on the Person Ombudsman in Sweden, which I think is a model of good practice. So I think here in Chile, the challenge and the opportunity is to think locally, but also to look globally and try and see, in terms of good practice, what can work well here in Chile.
Mucho bueno. Gracias por compartir tu experiencia con nosotros. Mi pregunta, el plan Islandia lleva un desarrollo hace más de 15 años al punto de partida que estamos tomando acá en Chile. Entonces, usted con los políticos, una vez gustaría saber cómo es el sentimiento de la sociedad civil y las personas con discapacidad después de haber aplicado el plan 15 años después. ¿Cómo se sienten las personas realmente incluidas, representadas, participativas o aún se sienten algo discriminadas? Muchas gracias.
I think actually in Ireland I think if you look from the 1970s onwards, we've had a massive deinstitutionalisation movement. And there's been much better awareness raising of the rights of people with disabilities. You know, I think there is an awful lot of frustration amongst families and people with disabilities about recent budget cuts because of the environment. And I think that there is great disappointment that the plan hasn't been implemented. But there's a real commitment by disabled people and their organisations to hold the government to account and to work and to lobby and to try and have even incremental implementation. So while they're very disappointed, they're very committed and they're very robust and they're very strategic. So it's disappointing about the lack of implementation and the financial situation. But there's still a real commitment and there's a very strong disabled persons organisation movement in Ireland. Thank you.